Well,
Yeah,
we might as well jump in here
let's do it.
to 19. I like Trey said, this is going to be part one. So I decided after thinking about it, looking through the content, this is probably going to be easiest, just to break it up into two parts, because there's really something discrete in each half of the chapter that I want to spend some time on. So this is the easiest way to go, and make sure I don't sort of short shrift something. So the focus today is really going to be the first 10 verses. So Revelation 19, 1 through 10, and even within that, especially verses 6 through 10. So I'm going to read the first 10 verses. We'll just leave it there. And this is ESV, so beginning in verse 1. We read, "After this I heard what seemed to be the loud voice of a great multitude in heaven, crying out, 'Hallelujah! Salvation and glory and power belong to our God. For his judgments are true and just. For he has judged the great prostitute who corrupted the earth with her immorality, and has avenged on her the blood of his servants.' Once more they cried out, 'Hallelujah! The smoke from her goes up forever and ever.' And the 24 elders and the 4 living creatures fell down and worshiped God who was seated on the throne, saying, 'Amen. Hallelujah.' And from the throne came a voice saying, 'Praise our God, all you who fear one great.'" Verse 6 then, "What seemed to be the voice of a great multitude, like the roar of many waters, and like the sound of mighty peals, of thunder, mighty peals of thunder, crying out, 'Hallelujah, for the Lord our God, the Almighty, reigns. Let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. It was granted her to clothe herself with fine linen, bright and pure. For the fine linen is the righteous deeds of the saints.' And the angel said to me, 'Write this, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb.' And he said to me, 'These are the true words of God.' And then I fell down at his feet to worship him, but he said to me, 'You must not do that. I am a fellow servant with you and your brothers who hold to the testimony of Jesus. Worship God, for the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy.'" Now, obviously, the major element you get here is the marriage supper of the Lamb. That's verses 6 through 10. And we're going to spend the bulk of our time in this episode on that. But you start at the beginning. We get the 24 elders mentioned. We've already dealt at length with that subject matter. The episodes that we did covering Revelation 4 and 5, you can go back and listen to those if you have not already. There is one other item before we hit the marriage supper, though, that I think is worth mentioning, because this has come up in several Q&As, and it specifically concerns the debate over, what is hell? What is the final punishment? It's probably a better way to put it. Is it some sort of everlasting, ongoing torment, or is it annihilation? So I've mentioned this before in Q&As that both the traditional view, which is this ongoing punishment idea, and annihilation, they're both defensible, textually defensible. For me, the debate turns on how to answer the question of the death of death. And specifically, this is Revelation 20, verse 14. So I'm going to just go down there real quickly. Revelation 20, verse 14, so you know what I'm talking about. This is the great white throne judgment, and in verse 14 we read, "Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire." This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. Yeah, and elsewhere, you're going to get language in 1 Corinthians about, the death of death. And so this raises a question. It raises a logical question, of course, a question of interpretation. Should we take this metaphorically, or is death really destroyed? And if it's the latter, if death is destroyed, then there can be no more death once death is destroyed. So if that's the case, it makes no sense to have ongoing death, ongoing eternal death, eternal punishment. Because if death is destroyed, there is no more death. Well, then how can you have more death if it's ongoing. Again, there's this logical, and it relates to interpretation, this sort of problem or conundrum. And again, it's very easy to argue that you have the death of death, if you can take the passage that way, and say, well, that means annihilation is the view we should hold. Honestly, they're both permanent. They're both everlasting punishment in that sense. One is just ongoing, and you have people continuing to die, even though you have the death of death. And so you have to figure out, how do we take this language so that makes sense? That's one side. And then the other side would say, well, we're just going to take it at face value and say that it's annihilation, because once you're annihilated, that's permanent too. So this is why I say they're both on the table interpretively. And this is really, for me, what the whole discussion hinges on. How do we take this language? I will add that the annihilation view, to me, seems to conform more to the original Edenic vision. What I mean by that is, in Eden originally, there was only life. There was no death. I mean, death gets introduced. It's an alien. It's a foreigner. And so in the new Eden, you would think, again, we're extrapolating here, but in the new Eden, you would think there's no more death. There's only life, just like the original Eden. And so again, that would favor the annihilation, perspective. Now, the traditional view, to be honest with you, typically does not focus on this question or this set of questions that I've just, put out here. Typically, the defense of the traditional view is verses like Revelation 14:11, and here in Revelation 19:3, there's a phrase about the smoke of their torment. In Revelation 19, it's her torment, Babylon's, goes up. The Greek term is anabino, goes up forever and ever. They see, that's eternal punishment. It's eternal suffering, because their smoke keeps going up forever and ever. Now, that sounds like a clear reference to ongoing, never-ending punishment, but Revelation 19:3 could be argued that kind of muddies the picture. So if we go back to Revelation 19, which we just read, just to pick up this one point before we get to the marriage supper, you read this. So it's the judgment and of the beast and Babylon and all this stuff, the great prostitute. And specifically, it says the smoke from her, her punishment, goes up forever and ever. So here's the question, and this is a legitimate interpretive question. Is God's vengeance against Babylon and the beast going to be forever ongoing? Like even in the new Eden, God is still taking revenge against Babylon and the beast? Or does the language just mean it was permanent and irreversible? So again, this whole notion, again, we're back to the same question. Does the language say, does it favor annihilation, it's permanent and irreversible? Or is it this ongoing vengeance, ongoing dying? And again, the issue being the death of death. Now, interestingly enough, when you get into verses 6 through 10, which we're going to do for the bulk of the episode today, when you get to the marriage supper of the Lamb, that passage and the whole concept of the great end times banquet, the messianic banquet, the eschatological banquet, is going to draw on Isaiah 25. And in Isaiah 25:8, even there you have a reference to the death of death. So the marriage supper, again, is sort of either tied to or maybe post the death of death. So even the marriage supper, the way it's presented in the Old Testament, contains this question, this idea, how do we take the language of the death of death? But I just wanted to throw that out there because, you get this phrase, and the assumption is that the phrase itself sort of settles something, but it actually doesn't, because you have to ask, interpretive questions like this. If we're 10,000 years into the new global Eden, is God still taking revenge on the beast? Is it ongoing? Well, or was it, that was a long time ago and it's permanent. We're done with that. It has no part in the new Eden. So that's your interpretive crossroads. Now, for the rest of our time today, we do want to focus on verses 6 through 10 and the marriage supper of the Lamb, which we read. And actually, this scene, this whole concept of the marriage supper of the Lamb, it's a messianic banquet, obviously, because the Lamb is Jesus. This is the climax to a motif found throughout Scripture. And the motif is the meal with God, a divine banquet. And before we get into some of the technical details, just to sort of stimulate your thinking a little bit here, think of all the meals with God or meals that people have in God's house that there are in the Bible. Again, now this is broader than sacrifices. In some of the sacrifices do have the priests participating by eating in the part of the sacrifice. That it's not all of them; it's a minority, but sometimes the priests do get to eat and partake part of the sacrifice. But that's kind of the point. That's just the priesthood, just the Levitical priesthood, and it's not all the sacrifices anyway. So, most of them don't really qualify there. What I'm talking about here is something a little bit bigger. Now God doesn't have to be present, eating himself, in anthropomorphic form. Sometimes in the passage you get that feel to it. For instance, in Revelation 19, when Jesus returns, the returned Christ, the returned Messiah, is never actually described as sitting down at the table and eating with his people. But nevertheless, it's the marriage supper of the Lamb. Okay, now at the Last Supper, Jesus alludes to drinking the fruit of the vine in the kingdom to come. All the Gospels have that. Matthew 26 through 29, for instance. Jesus says, I'm not going to drink of the fruit of the vine until the day, in the kingdom, and so on and so forth. But he actually never mentions the food, which is kind of interesting. It's not an element there. So when I talk about the meal with God motif, or meals that people have with God in God's house, it's not as though they all have to be anthropomorphic. Most of them are not going to be in that territory. But nevertheless, there is this sense of family community gathered around a meal in God's house, and therefore by extension with the Lord. So there are a number of these in the Bible. I would actually start off with the tree of life, because the tree of life is in Eden, which is God's house. It's God's abode. God is present anthropomorphically, like Genesis 3:8, even though that anthropomorphic language doesn't relate specifically to eating. It just says the Lord is walking, in the cool of the day, as a lot of translations have. So he's there, again, presented anthropomorphically, but it's not at a table sitting. But nevertheless, the tree of life is in Eden, and Eden is God's house. It's his temple. So Adam and Eve are obviously going to be eating of the tree of life, and this is kind of where the idea begins. It's a communal thing. You have Genesis 18. Now here's a very explicit one where Abraham shares a meal with the Lord, with Yahweh in human form and two angels. That's the most explicit one. Some would say that the manna might qualify here. It's food from heaven, the food of angels, as the Psalm says. Israel as a camp going through the wilderness is where God's presence is, because they're on their way to the land. And the Lord is there in the pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire. That's Exodus 16, so it's before the angel passage in Exodus 23. So, maybe that, it might count, manna might count. Exodus 24, 9 through 11 is pretty clear. This is when Moses and Aaron and Nadav and Abihu and the 70 elders of Israel go up into Mount Sinai, and they have a meal with God. It just says point blank. They saw the God of Israel and they ate and drank, with him, okay? So you get that. Think in the New Testament about Jesus sharing meals with the disciples. Well, Jesus is God incarnate. It's not just the disciples either. You have the feeding of the 4,000, the feeding of the 5,000. You have the Last Supper. You have the incident on the road to Emmaus where Jesus breaks bread and, with the two disciples there, and all of a sudden their eyes are open. They know who this is. It's the resurrected Christ. You have the post-resurrection meal in the upper room in Luke 24. You have Jesus by the seashore in John 21 when he eats, some fish with them. Of course, in the epistles, the big one is the Lord's table, communion, which again, we get hints of this in Paul, but we know from, early Christian writings that the Lord's table was usually accompanied by a feast. And in 1 Corinthians 11, that's pretty clear because one of the issues is that the Corinthians are using the occasion to get drunk. They're eating too much. They don't distribute the food among the poor. I mean, this is more than a communion wafer, okay? There was actually a meal in association with remembering the Lord through this sort of reenactment of the Last Supper. And you get all this, and then all this culminates logic, the marriage, which is important. Supper is a celebration. It's celebratory. And so it's not the same thing, at least in my thinking. It's not the same as the, quote, supper of God later in Revelation 19:17, which we're going to talk about next time, because that's where birds consume the flesh of the followers of the beast, those who are defeated. It's called the supper of God. And again, it's not the same. Because the marriage supper is very clearly a celebration. In the Old Testament, the passages we'll look at, it's very clearly, again, something that's a wonderful thing. It's not about eating the dead and all this kind of stuff. It's not about animals picking the remains or anything like that. That's what you get in Revelation 19:17, but the marriage supper is different. The bad one, or at least, the consumption of the chaos enemies, Revelation 19:17, the supper of God. That one is about, I would say metaphorically, and you could see how it would begin literally too, with an actual battle. And I think it has deep roots. What I mean by this is, let's just look at it this way. In Revelation 19:17, when the Lord returns and the forces of the beast are defeated and destroyed, you have this supper, which is the consumption of chaos forces, and it precedes the marriage supper of the Lamb. Okay, because I personally put the actual marriage supper of the Lamb in the New Eden. Here we get it mentioned in Revelation 19, but when you get to the New Eden, that's where you get, again, references to the tree of life. You get references to the garden, okay? the good stuff to eat that was originally in Eden. You get those kinds of descriptions later on. We don't have a strict chronological order here. And we can tell that even in Revelation 19, because the beast and his forces are spoken of as being destroyed, but they're not destroyed yet. That's going to come later in the chapter when the Lord comes back on the white horse and all this sort of stuff, when you have the climax of Armageddon. So we don't have a strict chronology here. I put the marriage supper, the actual event, afterwards in the new global Eden. But anyway, here back in Revelation 19, you have the consumption of chaos forces that are going to precede the marriage supper. The marriage supper and the supper of God, these two meals. One is the meal with God, that's a celebration. The other one is, again, the consumption of the chaos enemy. They might both be mentioned as a way to telegraph the two sides of the day of the Lord. And we think of it this way. So one is a judgment, okay, very obviously on the forces of evil and chaos. And the other one is a vindication or a celebration with the righteous, with the Lord. Now, we're going to pick up this a little bit later when we hit Psalm 74. There's going to be a reason that I bring up Psalm 74 in a moment. But Psalm 74 is the passage in the Psalms that quotes directly from the Canaanite Leviathan material. Leviathan, the great sea beast, again, the symbol of chaos that's just ubiquitous in antiquity. And it says that Leviathan, it ties in the defeat and the death of the destruction of Leviathan in conjunction with passing through the Red Sea at the Exodus. And it says that Leviathan was given to them as food. Now you can go back and read the Exodus account over and over and over again. You're never going to get, there was a big dragon slain back there and everybody got a meal. Everybody got a steak. Okay, again, it's metaphorical language, but it's applied to the forces of Egypt. It's applied to Pharaoh and his army because that was the major chaos enemy at that time in the Old Testament. Later on, it's going to become Babel. And of course, here in Revelation, it's Babylon. So you may have something going on there, and I think you do, but we'll hit that in a moment. Again, the positive side of this is the celebration that I think takes place in the New Jerusalem. So you've got two meals mentioned in Revelation 19. One is the marriage supper, which is a celebration. The other one is a judgment against the forces of the beast. Now, when it comes to the eschatological banquet, you may recall some of this might be ringing around in your head because we actually touched on the eschatological banquet in episode 383. We got into this a little bit. And I read a section from Brand Petre's book on the Lord's Supper. Again, because he's done a lot of work on, again, Old Testament and Second Temple Judaism, the discussion of the literature of that period on the meals with God and the messianic banquet, the eschatological banquet, all of it. He goes into the Second Temple material, even the rabbinic material a lot. And so I read a section from his book, and I'm going to go back and summarize that. I'm not going to read the whole thing again from episode 383, but I want to read a few things and then go out to some places in Isaiah just to sort of set the Old Testament context for the marriage supper, because this is what we're doing in this series. We're trying to situate what's happening in the book of Revelation in, against the backdrop that is the Old Testament. This is what John's drawing on and what he wants people to think about, how he's connecting the theological dots between the testaments. So Petre writes this. He says, multiple passages in the Jewish scriptures use the image of a banquet or feast to describe the joy of the coming age of salvation. However, by far the most explicit description of an eschatological banquet in the Old Testament is in the book of Isaiah. In the midst of a series of descriptions of the coming day of the Lord, and the chapters for that are Isaiah 24 through 27. Scholars refer to those chapters, by the way, as the little apocalypse of the Old Testament, sort of like the mini book of Revelation in the Old Testament. So in the midst of a series of the coming, descriptions of the coming day of the Lord in those chapters, the prophet speaks of a future banquet for Israel and, this is important, and the nations. The messianic banquet is an eschatological event. This eschatological dimension is evident from the fact that the banquet culminates in the overthrow of suffering and death. And here, this is going to be Isaiah 25:8. God will, quote, swallow up death forever and wipe away tears from all faces. That's Isaiah 25:8. And again, it takes you back to is death gone or is it not? Again, because that directly factors into, one's view of what is the final judgment, the final punishment, that sort of thing. Petre writes, at the time of the banquet, God will take away the reproach of his people and give them salvation. Now, I want to read a few things. I'm going to start with Isaiah 24, specifically verse 21. Again, this is the beginning of the little apocalypse in Isaiah. And we read this. Isaiah 24, I'm going to read 21 through 23. On that day, the Lord will punish the host of heaven in heaven. There's the gods being judged, supernatural beings. And the kings of the earth on the earth. There's the people. Okay, so you get two sides of the same coin. The day of the Lord, both God's cosmic and his human enemies will be judged. They will be gathered together as prisoners in a pit. They will be shut up in a prison. And after many days they will be punished. Then the moon will be confounded and the sun ashamed, for the Lord of hosts reigns on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and his glory will be before his elders. That reference there, Isaiah 24:23, to Yahweh's elders is something I discuss in Unseen Realm, and it is a reference to the divine council. You keep going in Isaiah 25, the very next chapter. I'm going to read verses 6 through 8. On this mountain, this is a reference to Zion, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples, not just Israel, all peoples, a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine well refined. And he will swallow up on this mountain the covering that is cast over all peoples, the veil that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever. And the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces. And the reproach of his people he will take away from all the earth. For the Lord has spoken. So basically, this is, as scholars would say, a very universalistic passage. That doesn't mean universalism like no one gets destroyed or no one goes to hell or anything like that. Universalism in scholar speak, when it refers to the Old Testament, refers to the inclusion of the pagan Gentile nations in the salvation vision of Israel and her Messiah. So all the nations, did you catch how many times I said all? It's very clear. This is an eschatological banquet for all peoples. So back to Petre, he writes, the eschatological banquet utilizes cultic imagery. You have references, elsewhere in these chapters, Isaiah, to fatten things and wine on the lees. This is technical terminology for sacrificial offerings of the temple cult, as when Deuteronomy speaks of the, quote, fat of their sacrifices and the wine of their drink offering, unquote. For example, Deuteronomy 32, 37, 38, Leviticus 3:3, Leviticus 4:8 and 9. This cultic dimension is important to stress since Isaiah explicitly states that the banquet will take place, quote, on the mountain of the Lord, which in context refers to Mount Zion in Jerusalem. The eschatological banquet will be an international banquet, which will include both the restored tribes of Israel and the Gentile nations. The feast will be for all peoples and will result in the veil that is cast over all the nations or Gentiles being lifted. The eschatological banquet specifically involves the death of death. In other words, the death of death equals everlasting life. Again, this is specifically noted in Isaiah 25:8, which is again referred to in Revelation 20, verse 14. Altogether, Petre writes, the eschatological banquet is a universal, i.e., all the nations' vision of salvation, nestled right in the heart of one of the most widely read prophets of the Old Testament. And that's the end of his quote. But Petre and other scholars go on to point out that this eschatological messianic banquet is described in Second Temple literature, passages like 2 Baruch 29 and 30, as having the flesh of Leviathan and Behemoth served at the meal. This is where we ran into it back in episode 383. And that imagery, the whole idea that, well, what are we going to be eating at the Messianic banquet? Oh, it's Leviathan and Behemoth. Leviathan was the great sea beast, the sea symbol of chaos. Behemoth was the land equivalent. These were the two beasts that symbolized, again, the threat of the natural world and the disorder of the world in which we live and how it's threatening and it's the realm of death and suffering and all this stuff. This imagery is drawn from Psalm 74, 13 and 14. And I'm going to read that passage. So here we are back at Psalm 74. Psalm 74, 13 says, I'm going to go up to verse 12. This is a reference back to both Exodus and the creation account. If you're familiar with this podcast, we've been in Psalm 74 before. It's an interesting psalm. It says, "Yet God, my King, is from of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. You divided the sea by your might. You split the sea, divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. You split open springs and brooks, and you dried up ever-flowing streams. Yours is the day, yours also the night. You have established the heavenly lights and the sun, and fixed all the boundaries of the earth. You have made summer and winter." Now, Leviathan is very explicitly mentioned here. But just in Psalm 74:14, the idea that Leviathan, when the Israelites go through the waters of the sea, as on dry land, okay, that the idea that Leviathan was given to them as food is not literal. Again, no one's saying, wow, look at what's at the bottom of the Red Sea. It's this big dragon. It's Leviathan. Let's have a barbecue. Okay, it's not literal. It's a reference to chaos being consumed. Okay, chaos beaten. This is imagery. It's metaphor. And it's done, you'll notice in verse 14 of Psalm 74 that it's the animals. The animals are the ones that eat. The animals are the ones that pick the carcass of Leviathan. Leviathan has been destroyed. Chaos has been conquered on this day at the Exodus. That's the whole point. So it's just like Revelation 19:17, where you have this notion of a supper of God, great supper of God, marking the defeat of the beast. Leviathan had multiple heads, the beast had multiple heads. We've talked about how Leviathan is part of the Daniel 7, imagery. Again, all these things fit together. To us, they might sound odd, they might not. How do we put all this together? It all goes together if you understand, again, the metaphors and the symbols that are being used here that come right out of the Old Testament and the way the Old Testament uses them. So, again, we have a victory over chaos here. Now, I would suggest, this is just a suggestion, but again, this is possible. I'm sort of, this isn't a specifically exegetical point, but this is just sort of a free thought here. So the idea, like it could have began with literal Egyptian corpses washing up and being exposed in regard to God's destruction of Egypt's army pursuing the Israelites. I mean, that's going to happen. And so, given its use in Psalm 74 alongside creation imagery, the theological notion of creation order emerging from chaos, which is part of Genesis, okay, Genesis 1, the theological notion of creation order emerging from chaos is also part of the Psalm's meaning. So, deliverance from Egypt yields a new creation. Israel has been extracted from Egypt. The tribes have now been made something new. They're a nation. They're on their way to God's mountain to receive the law, their constitution. And then they're going to go get the land. They're going to have a temple, all these things. God is doing something new. So, the Egyptian bodies that get picked on, that might have been a very convenient thing to take people's minds back to. Hey, remember the day that Egypt was defeated and, the birds and the animals picked the carcasses and so on and so forth. Using that imagery to talk about the defeat of God's enemies, the defeat of all that is opposed to Yahweh and his people, the anti-Eden forces of chaos in the world. Again, so there could have been a literal starting point for the metaphor, but the important angle here is the metaphor. So you have the metaphor of the conquest of chaos and the emergence of a new creation, which is exactly what you're going to get in the book of Revelation. The beast, chaos is conquered, and what's going to emerge? The new Eden, okay, out of all of it. So we're tracking on familiar territory here. So again, the point of Revelation 19:17, which we're going to deal with a little bit more next week, is that the supper of God again is this judgment. It's a triumph over the righteous as well, a triumph for the righteous as well. It's two sides of this coin, and then we're going to take that and we're going to move into, once chaos is conquered, we're going to have a great celebration in the new Eden, with the abundance of Eden, with the Lord present. We're going to have the final everlasting meal with God, the everlasting marriage supper with the Savior, who is our brother, our King, again, the Messiah. This is where everything is headed. Now, I want to go a little bit further here, just for a few minutes here. And I'm going to go to Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary. There's an interesting entry on the Messianic Banquet written by last name Smith. First name escapes me right now. But in talking about the eschatological banquet, he writes this. The Messianic banquet, the eschatological banquet, is a banquet at which the Messiah is deemed to be present, and it has its apparent roots in another pattern found in certain ancient Near Eastern creation myths. So it's even wider than the Bible. It's actually something that you can find elsewhere in the ancient Near East in certain respects. So these myths tell of a great battle being waged in the divine world, the divine sphere. When the battle has been won, the gods assemble and celebrate the victory with a great banquet. It's a very common idea. Here, what we've got going on in the Old Testament, we have a festive meal as the primary social institution for celebrating victory and deliverance. So, we get this idea in the Old Testament. It's going to spill over into the New Testament. And Smith says, because apocalyptic literature takes up the combat and victory motifs, the banquet of celebration becomes part of the repertoire as well. And he gives a few examples of David, David being the prototype for Messiah, having celebratory meals with his men as the new king, and so on and so forth. And he mentions First Enoch. In First Enoch, in that day, the Lord shall triumph over the kings and rulers of the earth. And there's a sacrifice with the Son of Man, the Messiah, in the book of Enoch. This is First Enoch 62. So again, the idea is familiar to the ancient Near East, the Old Testament, Second Temple Judaism, and of course, when you get on into the New Testament, that's where it's easiest for us to see because of New Testament language, things like the Last Supper and so on. So Smith writes, in the New Testament, the messianic banquet theme is especially prominent in the gospel tradition. Jesus' provisions for the hungry in his food miracles, and he gives a grocery list of gospel references, are paralleled by the theme of the Beatitudes. Quote, blessed are you that hunger now, for you shall be satisfied. I mean, think about that. That's easy to read over, but if you could actually read that as a promise, if you're going to follow the Messiah, you're going to be present at the eschatological meal. Blessed are you that hunger now, for you shall be satisfied. In one of the favorite images of the parables, the kingdom is compared to a great banquet. Matthew 22, 1 through 10, for example. Indeed, the themes of joyous banquet, judgment, pilgrimage of the nations, and presence of the Messiah are marvelously brought together. The theme of the pilgrimage of the nations to the table becomes the rallying cry for the emerging Gentile church, and when combined with the divine reversal theme, is interpreted to mean that they will take the place of Israel at the table, at least ethnic Israel, but not believing Israel. I tell you, this is Matthew 8, 11 and 12. I tell you that many will come from east and west and sit at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness, and there men will weep and gnash their teeth. So the point that Smith is referring to here is that just because you're an ethnic Jew doesn't mean you're going to be at the eschatological banquet. You must embrace Israel's Messiah, who is Jesus. Okay, your ethnicity doesn't get you there. That's not your identity. You need to align your belief in him. You need to be a believer. You need to not just believe the covenants of Abraham and David. You need to believe the new covenant, which promised the Messiah and the coming of the Spirit. And all this is going to play out in the Gospels and, of course, the book of Acts. It's foreshadowed, it's telegraphed here, so that the irony is that you're going to have many people who, were part of Israel that reject their Messiah, and they're not going to have a seat at the table. Again, that's the irony presented here. Now we can ask one last question: why the marriage element in all this? Why is it at a wedding banquet, the marriage supper of the Lamb? And I would say this, and I'm with the mainstream here. The wedding illustrates the marriage element to all this. Illustrates the oneness of the king and his people. Marriage is used as a metaphor for the relationship of God with his people, Israel. Hosea 2, verses 1 through 23, Isaiah 54, 4 through 8. Or in the New Testament, as a symbol for the relationship of Christ and the church. Again, that's pretty self-evident. Conversely, adultery is a common biblical symbol of spiritual infidelity, spiritual disloyalty. So you have believing loyalty versus unbelieving disloyalty, and play it off against each other. Now, Smith writes this: more important just generally the marriage element for apocalyptic thought, is Isaiah 54:5 through 55:5, where the theme of a divine marriage, Isaiah 54:5, is combined with a joyful feast, which is characterized by the abundance of food, Isaiah 55:1 and 2, and the vindication for the righteous, Isaiah 54:6 through 17, and the pilgrimage of the nations, to Zion, Isaiah 55:5. There you have all the elements. And Smith writes, this theme is then taken up in the New Testament, where you have the marriage element with the eschatological banquet element combined in Isaiah 54 and 55. This theme is taken up in the New Testament, where it becomes a prominent image for the joys of the kingdom in the gospel tradition, again, especially in the parables. So that is what I wanted to cover today. I mean, again, the marriage supper of the Lamb is not just kind of a neat, metaphor or a neat teaching point that, the gospel writers come up with or John comes up with. This has deep Old Testament roots. And again, the elements are very specific. The Messiah is there. There's a meal with the Messiah in God's house. We have the Edenic restoration because of the abundance of food. We've got, the nations included, they're pilgrims to Zion. They have come back to the true God. All these things that we really, that the whole book, Revelation, has been leading up to, because you get chapters 14 through 18, and basically all of that is about, if you align yourselves with the beast, you're going to be destroyed. If you name the name of the beast, if you take the name, you take the number, which is the name, you're going to be destroyed. But if you don't, if you remain faithful, and you're going to have a seat at the eschatological banquet, and it's coming. It's coming. The day of the Lord is coming. And again, all of this was foreshadowed and prophesied in the Old Testament. All the elements are there. So once again, John isn't coming up with something novel or new or interesting or innovative. He's looking forward. He's getting this vision. He's looking forward to, how the Messiah is going to be the key figure, the linchpin figure, not only just to come back and beat up on the Gentiles, the day of the Lord stuff, all that good whooping, but it's so much wider than that, because he's also there to claim as his own, which is the job of the church, to do the Great Commission. He's there to claim as his own people from all the nations. Again, it's even here, we're in Revelation 19, and we're still doing the reversal of the Deuteronomy 32 thing, and it's almost complete. Again, Deuteronomy 32, Psalm 82, the judgment of the nations, which are the people and their gods who rule over them, the principalities and powers, and the nations being brought back into the fold, the gospel, the doors are wide open. These are the times in which we live. We have the kingdom already. The opportunity is there now, and we are moving, forward to the fullness of the Gentiles. This is the fullness of the Gentiles. It's another element. Again, on God's timetable, he will know when the fullness of the Gentiles has been reached. And then, to quote Paul, the end will come, just in abbreviated form. We know how things are going to play out. And John, again, is telling us the same thing, but he's using lots of symbolic and metaphorical language, even more than Paul. I mean, Paul does that as well. But again, trying to convey the destruction and death of chaos and the emergence of a new Eden, because when all the destruction and death are happening, the earth is being purified. It is being prepared for occupation by the rightful owner, by the rightful king. It is being prepared to once again be fit for sacred space, all of it, the whole world, every nation. So again, these are just helpful trajectories that I think will make us a better reader of the book of Revelation. Again, it's a dense book. We all know that. We knew that going in. But it has deep roots in the Old Testament. And so the more we can sort of, have our memories jarred back into certain passages in the Old Testament, certain concepts, the better off we'll be when we try to, tackle the book. So, in part 2 here in Revelation 19, we're going to cover Revelation 19, 11 through 21, which is the rest of the chapter. So I'm going to start off by reading that and then telegraph where we're going to be going here. So Revelation 19:11, reading from the ESV, says, "Then I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems, and he has a name written that no one knows but himself. He is clothed in a robe dipped in blood, and the name by which he is called is the Word of God. And the armies of heaven, arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with the rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury, the wrath of God the Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Then I saw an angel standing in the sun, and with a loud voice he called to all the birds that fly directly overhead, Come, gather for the great supper of God, to eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses and their riders, and the flesh of all men, both free and slave, both small and great. And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth with their armies gathered to make war against him, who was sitting on the horse, and against his army. And the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet, who in its presence had done the signs by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast, and those who worshipped its image. These two were thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur, and the rest were slain by the sword that came from the mouth of him who was sitting on the horse, and all the birds were gorged with their flesh." So that is Revelation 19:11. It's the Battle of Armageddon, and again, this is very familiar. The Old Testament references here are very easy to pick out by this point because they're somewhat repetitious with where we've already been. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the obvious things. We have the reference to eyes like a flame of fire. Again, that was earlier in the book for the risen Christ, drawing on language from Daniel. And of course, he has many crowns. The name written, he is marked with the name of Yahweh, just like the beast. His followers are marked with the name of the beast, so on and so forth. So the name by which he's called is the Word of God. I am that I am. Most scholars, opt for that particular word here. Armies of heaven is familiar, angelic host imagery from the Old Testament. Again, very, very easy to pick out, especially for those who've read Unseen Realm. Again, following him on the white horses. We had the earlier reference to Zechariah 14 that the Lord will come with all his holy ones. Again, earlier in the book. So a lot of this stuff, again, we've seen already. We've seen he will rule them with a rod of iron, which interestingly enough is applied to Jesus, the returning Christ here. But back in Revelation 3:21. Or Revelation 2, I think it was 26 in this case, this particular citation, that was language spoken about us as believers. Okay, the one who overcomes, the believer who overcomes, he will rule the nations with a rod of iron. So it's this shared messianic rule. Revelation 3:21, Jesus shares his throne, with the one who overcomes, believers. And so that language here of a group of holy ones arrayed in white linen. Well, that's us. These are the members of the divine council, the heavenly host. And we're going to get more of that in this episode and next. Just specific phrases again that tie into the notion, that reinforce the notion that believers are, even now when we die, we become members of the council, and we just await what the Lord wants us to do. And this is part of it. We are the holy ones along with the supernatural holy ones who return to earth to judge evil and destroy the gods. So, a lot of this, again, is familiar territory. Where I want to focus today is really on verses 17 through 21. Believe it or not, these descriptions of the birds eating the flesh and the very brief note about the nations that are gathered again against the Lord, at Jerusalem, at Har-Magedon, Har-Mageddon, the Mount of Assembly, Jerusalem, Zion. That has something to do with deception is going to become important. These little phrases that don't seem to mean so much. Again, the birds, the deception, and of course this ends with the lake of fire and so on and so forth. That's actually going to become really important because of what I want to do and what I'm going to interact with here in this episode. And it will overlap into our next episode when we focus more in chapter 20. We'll hit a little bit of chapter 20 here because we have to. But in the next episode on chapter 20, there'll be more of it. So what I want to do in this episode is interact with Meredith Klein's article. Now, those of you who have read Unseen Realm in the chapter on Armageddon know that I footnote this article. And the article is entitled Har-Mageddon, subtitle The End of the Millennium. And that was an article published in the Journal for the Evangelical Theological Society in 1996, specifically volume 39. Now, what I want to do here is because Klein is, to my knowledge, the only evangelical Old Testament scholar, the only evangelical scholar, period, who recognized very clearly the fact that Har-Magedon, the mount, Har is mount. I mean, John tells us that Har-Magedon, Armageddon, is in the Hebrew tongue. Okay, Har-Magedon, mount of something. And it can't be Megiddo because there is no mountain there. Anyone who's been to the site, the first question should be to your tour guide, where is the mountain? Because there isn't any. It's a plain. So Klein, again, thought, this is all an unseen realm. We've discussed it in earlier episodes too. What if we're not dealing with Hebrew MGD, the first three consonants of Megiddo, and why it ends with an N? Again, you can read Unseen Realm and into the footnotes, and you'll find out why. What if instead we have Har and then Mem Gayan, the other Hebrew consonant that has that G sound, like Gomorrah is actually not spelled with Hebrew G, Gimel. It's spelled with Gayan, Gomorrah. It has that back of the throat G sound. So Klein's like, well, what if we have Mem Gayan Dalet and we have Har-Mageddon? And as soon as he came to that observation, the whole thing opened up, because Har-Mageddon is the Mount of Assembly from Isaiah 14. This is where God rules. It's Zion. It's Jerusalem. And this is why the other language associated with this battle is associated with Jerusalem in the passages. Again, read Unseen Realm. You'll get all the data, or again, go back and listen to some of the comments we've had here. So Klein took this reality, this textual reality, and he went to the book of Revelation and said, okay, if this is Jerusalem, this is a final battle for Jerusalem, where in the Old Testament do we see such a battle depicted and fought? And the obvious answer emerged pretty quickly, and that is the Gog-Magog incident of Ezekiel 38 and 39. Now, Gog and Magog are actually mentioned explicitly in Revelation 20, but we're not there yet. We're in Revelation 19. And so what Klein does in his article is he basically looks for all of the places where John in Revelation 16 through Revelation 20, up to Revelation 20. And we could include Revelation 20 for the sake of our discussion here. Revelation 16 through 20, where in those passages does John repurpose and utilize the Gog-Magog elements in those chapters? And not just Gog-Magog, but other Old Testament passages that have a final climactic battle for Zion, for Jerusalem. So where does John use those passages, especially Ezekiel 38 and 39? And it turns out that John uses them in several places in all of these chapters. And so Klein says, look, there's only one way to parse this. And I agree with him as far as what's happening in the text. And that is, John is describing the same conflict 3 or 4 times in these chapters. It's recapitulation. John is recycling this material to describe the climactic defeat, conflict and defeat of the beast. And he doesn't just do it in Revelation 20 when he mentions Gog, Magog. He does it in chapter 19. He does it in chapter 18. He does it in chapter 17. So if you recall, as a listener to this series, I have said a few times before that most people approach the book of Revelation and they assume, there's no instruction manual at the front of the book or at the end, but they assume that we're supposed to read Revelation as a linear, sequential chronology. And I've said before, there are places where that just is not the case. You can't read it that way and understand what's going on. And this is ground zero for that assertion. So Klein's article, I think, does a great job of showing how from Revelation 16 through 20, we have recapitulation. We have a repeated cycling of descriptions of the same events. We have followers of the beast getting the mark. We have the beast chaos system persecuting Christians. We have them eventually massing against Zion, the Lord, for one final battle to essentially stop the plan of God from happening. We have the return of Christ, the destruction of the beast and his system, and then we go off into the final resurrection and judgments and the kingdom return to earth. John recycles those series of events 3 or 4, maybe 5 times in these chapters. They are not to be read as a linear chronology of separate events. Now, when you do this, and Klein, his subtitle of his article, The End of the Millennium, when you do this, you are forced to the conclusion that the 1,000-year references in the beginning of Revelation 20 are not a future millennial rule. They are the church age. They are the present church age. And I agree with that too, with one exception that we'll hit at the end of this episode and on into Revelation 20. There's something Klein has missed that I'm going to point out to you. But Klein was an amillennialist, and so he uses this information to destroy the premillennial eschatological system. And that's what I want to track on today. I'm telling you, telegraphing this all up front. I hope that by the end of this episode and the next, you will see the importance of not attaching your theology, or not, let me put it this way, not equating biblical theology with a theological system. Because if you do that, you have no literal kingdom to look forward to. Klein successfully destroys the standard premillennial understanding of Revelation 16 through 20. He does it by virtue of how the Old Testament is used by John over and over and over and over again in cycles. You cannot read it as a linear chronology. It doesn't work. So that's going to leave us with a question at the end of this episode that Klein has to answer and all systems have to answer. I'm going to propose my own answer in the following episode. But I'm just telling you where we're going. It's going to sound confusing. Well, if I'm just reading the book of Revelation, Mike, the chapters follow each other, and this is a series of events. One just happens after the other. No, it doesn't, and I'm going to show you why, using Klein's work here, how John is reproducing the same passages different times in these Revelation chapters. Now, to sort of understand where Klein's going with this, we need to summarize a little bit of some Revelation content to this point. And I'm going to go all the way back to chapter 6, Revelation 6 through 18. So if you look, let's just take the seal judgments. The first 4 of the 7 seal judgments are in Revelation 6, and they're very general. They follow the description of Jesus, that he gave his disciples, that his followers would be persecuted. If you read Mark 13, 3 through 13, it's going to sound remarkably like the first 4 seal judgments of Revelation 6. That's not an accident. Okay, John and Mark they're tracking together. In fact, I will read you this one passage. Let's go to Mark 13 just to make the point of how this really sounds. So we've got Mark 13, beginning in verse 3. This is Jesus on the Mount of Olives, the signs of the end of the age. Now just listen to this. As he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished?" And Jesus began to say to them, "See that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of the birth pains. Be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to councils. You will be beaten in synagogues. You will stand before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them." Okay, all of that, every one of those elements you'll find in Revelation 6 going forward, every one of them. And then we hit verse 10 in Mark 13, and the gospel must first be proclaimed to all the nations. There we go again, linking the return of the Lord to the fullness of the Gentiles. And when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand what you are to say, but whatever is given you in that hour, that is what you say. For it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. Brother will deliver brother over to death, and father his child. Children will rise against parents. You will be hated for all my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end. Oh, doesn't that sound like the book of Revelation? He that overcomes to the end will be saved. And then you hit, the abomination and so on and so forth. So the point is that you could go back to these discourses in the Gospels and look at what Jesus said would happen before his coming, and you'll find all of it in the book of Revelation. So the seal judgments are very general in sort of laying, beginning the first of these three cycles of judgments. The fifth seal unleashes a response to the martyrdom of the followers of the Lamb. So God, starts, taking revenge against the persecution of his followers. The sixth seal is the end of the cosmos as humanity knows it. It's classic Old Testament language for the dissolution of the heavens. And the seventh seal, remember that was in Revelation 8, that was silence in heaven. And there was a lot of Sinai imagery, and commentators pretty much, land on the idea that the silence is there because those who see what's about to come are aghast. They're shocked at what's going to happen when God unleashes his revenge at the day of the Lord right before Jesus' return. They're shocked. So we've got this general judgment, and then we've got, again, this silence about what's going to happen. And then we get the trumpet judgment. So this is the next cycle. There are numerous parallels to the Egyptian plagues, as we've already noticed. In trumpets 1 through 4, the first 4 echo the first 4 seal judgments. So right there, if you compare the first 4 trumpets to the first 4 seal judgments, there's repetition. There's repetition. And, again, it's going to be general judgment on the earth. There's your Exodus elements. But the judgments, the seals and the trumpets narrow to God's punishment of those who are persecuting his followers. Those who believe in him, it's a response, again, to their martyrdom. So the followers of the beast start to get, pardon the pun, marked. They're in the crosshairs for judgment. And eventually everything leads up to a final climactic battle, which is Armageddon. So in the case of the trumpets, you've got, again, general plagues, first 4. The fifth trumpet is the release of the watchers in Revelation 9. And this gives us the spiritual chaos element of the end of days, as opposed to just human destruction, human, persecution of Christians. Now, we see there's a supernatural element behind it. In later chapters, this fifth slot, or this spiritual, supernatural chaos slot will be filled by the beast himself, the harlot of Babylon, the whole Babylon system. The sixth trumpet is the drying up of the Euphrates. Again, it's not about China. It's a massive army from quote-unquote Babylon. They are the world chaos enemy, as we've talked in the preceding 2 or 3 episodes here. Everything points to Babylon, which is expected because Babylon, the rebellion back at the Tower of Babel, is where we get the nations who align themselves with other gods against the true God. This is just axiomatic. The Deuteronomy 32 worldview just provides the perfect framework for this. So the sixth trumpet is the drying up of the Euphrates. The massive army from quote-unquote Babylon gathers against the people of God, preparing to confront Zion And this is Armageddon, Har-Magedon, the battle that occurs at the Mount of Assembly, Yahweh's mountain, which is Zion. The seventh trumpet heralds the kingdom of God. Well, that's logical, because after Armageddon, that's what happens next. We're going to have the general resurrection, the righteous to life, the unrighteous to death. And then we get the kingdom return to earth in full consummation. The king, Revelation 11:15 about the seventh trumpet. The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. Again, the trumpets repeat a cycle that we saw with the seals. There's the same general flow of events, and they borrow imagery from Egyptian plague stuff, from Sinai stuff, from Babylon stuff in the Old Testament. John is cycling through the same set of ideas. Now, if you remember back in our discussion of the 144,000 in Revelation 7, that was, the 144,000, we sort of landed on, these are Jewish followers of Jesus, but that's not to exclude a great multitude of Gentiles, because in Revelation 7:9, we get a reference to those who would not be numbered among the Jews. It's a more generic reference to nations. Then collectively, that multitude are believers who endure to the end. They don't give up the faith, and they have a home in the new Eden. Their description is distinct, the Gentile element, from the 144,000. So the idea that this is only Jews, is not correct. I mean, you get both sides going on in the saved remnant. It's not only the 144,000. There are multitudes from the nations that also refuse to follow the beast and wind up on the Lord's side. So the 144,000, again, could be either Jewish followers of Jesus or Old Testament language of Israel applied to the church, again, which includes Jewish believers. But again, I kind of like the giving the Jewish element its due and then looping in the Gentiles, through verse 9. But anyway, my point here is that the assembling of the army of the beast against this group, again, is a precursor to Armageddon and the kingdom, and both Jewish and Gentile believers are in the picture somewhere. They're both being targeted. John does this because he elsewhere frequently applies Old Testament Israel language to the church. The most obvious, of course, is Exodus 19:6, its kingdom of priests. He refers to the church as the kingdom of priests, the church including Gentiles, in Revelation 1:6, Revelation 5:10, and Revelation 20, verse 6. So to view Revelation 7 as some sort of only Jewish thing is a mistake. And I mention it because you'll see this in dispensational systems. Again, you cannot exclude the Gentile element from the saved and sanctified, those who choose to follow the Lord, before the end of the days. And now that fits wonderfully if a lot of this is about the present age, because the present age we have the church, and the church is circumcision neutral. So again, there's a consistency here, but I wanted to just throw that out because some of you are going to be thinking that right away. You need to go back and listen to the Revelation 7, episodes. So what about some of the patterning to this point? Again, there's judgment on the earth. Again, very, very, very general, and it's going to funnel specifically to those who align themselves with the beast. Believers are quote unquote sealed and protected if we follow the Exodus imagery to its consistent point. Whether this means protection from any physical harm is debated. And the Egyptian parallels might suggest that, but not all the judgments have Egyptian plague parallels. Some of them don't. So we can't be, really hard and fast about that either. But at the least, it seems to denote more consistently protection from evil spirits. In other words, the protection and sealing that goes on at the end of days is really about keeping believers loyal to the gospel, preventing them, assisting them, helping them to not surrender the faith, helping them to overcome. It shouldn't be viewed as a guarantee against physical harm. Rather, it's supernatural assistance to overcome, to stay with the faith, to keep believing. Beale and Campbell, this is Beale's, they have a shorter version of Beale's commentary. These two guys, Beale and then he had editorial help from Campbell, put together. They write this in that particular volume. The demonic powers are forbidden to harm those with the seal of God on their forehead. Uppermost in John's mind is not physical security, but protection of the unbeliever, or protection of the believers, faith and salvation, from the various sufferings and persecutions that are inflicted upon them. whether by Satan or his demonic and earthly agents. The sealing enables God's people to respond in faith to the trials through which they pass, so that these trials become the very instruments by which they are strengthened in their faith. Again, I think that's well said. I think it's important. This is all preparation for Armageddon. It's all preparation for the final conflict, the final judgment of human and cosmic evil, the final reversal of chaos. He that endures to the end will be saved. He that endures to the end will judge, the nations. He'll rule the nations with a rod of iron. He that endures to the end, I will share my throne with him. Okay, this is all meant to encourage loyalty, believing loyalty to the gospel. Then you get to the bowl judgments. The bowl judgments are the fodder for Revelation 16. First three bowls draw on the language of the Egyptian plagues again, just like the trumpets did. They recycle the first four trumpet judgments. There we go. It's not a linear chronology. It's recycling. The fourth and fifth bowl judgments seem to be a reverse of the plague of darkness we talked about earlier, because it has people scorched by the sun, and in keeping with the Egyptian plague of darkness, which is bowl number 5. It is with this judgment that the connections from Egypt as chaos agent in the Old Testament sort of transferred to Babylon, because Babylon becomes the arch rival and arch enemy as biblical history moves on. It's in this judgment that sort of transition is most apparent. Babylon, of course, becomes a code name for Rome, because Rome in John's day, when he's writing the book of Revelation, they, not literal Babylon, but they are the primary chaos agent. They have inherited that status from Babylon. But everybody, that when John writes, when he talks about Babylon, everybody knows what he's talking about. God's arch enemy. Now, we're going to use this to portray the Roman Empire. And we talked about how that has to be because the inauguration of the kingdom of God in Daniel 2, and Daniel 7, of course, but Daniel 2, the stone made without hands, happens in the day of the last kingdom, which is Rome. Okay? So again, all of this fits. Now, Beale and Campbell draw attention to this, to one particular thing they write. This punishment of the fourth bowl, occurring prior to the reign of Christ, anticipates the final judgment of Babylon, which also will be burned by fire. In other words, scorched with fire. In Revelation 17:16 and 18:8, there it's burned up with fire. So that's an important link. Again, that sort of, links these judgments together, these three different groups of judgments. There are threads that link them together. The sixth bowl explicitly references the drying of the Euphrates to make way for the kings of the east, which is a clear reference to Babylon and its hordes, both human and demonic. Specifically, Revelation 16:12 through 15 describe the demonic element of the Babylon chaos system. So, and in verse 16, we get to the end of chapter 16, John learns the hordes are being gathered at Har-Magedon. So that brings us to Armageddon. Again, these judgments, these three sets of judgments are recycling each other. They tell the same basic storyline of who the enemy is, the persecution of believers, God pouring out his wrath on the earth generally, and then more particularly on those who take the mark. The reaction from those is anger. We're gonna confront Yahweh at Zion. We're gonna put an end to this. We're not gonna let Yahweh have his way, his plan. We're going to gather together against, Zion, against him and Zion, and we are going to stop him. That's what we're going to do. And again, that's Armageddon. And then as we get into chapter 19, of course, they are defeated dramatically by the returning Jesus with us, with believers. And then, the rest, again, leads off into the final judgments and the new Eden return to earth. Again, it's a familiar storyline repeated through chapters 16 through 20. And that brings us to Klein. Okay, so I'm going to be pulling some points from his article, but most of the detail remains there, and his article is in the protected folder if you want to read it. So we've seen in this summary that the seal judgments set up the trumpets, again, which are largely recycled in the bowls. And it's this recycling that draws the attention of many interpreters of Revelation. Scholars have noticed this, many of them, because it continues into Revelation 17, 18, 19, and 20. So we're going to focus on Har-Mageddon, the Mount of Assembly, and how that specifically gets repeated. Not just, just because Gog and Magog are referenced in Revelation 20, verse 8, doesn't mean that's the first time we see the battle. We see elements of Ezekiel 38 and 39 before we ever get to Revelation 20. And that's what Klein noticed. So after we get this in our heads that Har-Mageddon is Zion and Jerusalem, and Klein again follows the same bunny trail that I do in Unseen Realm. If you need a review of that material, you can go back and read it. But I'm just going to give you what Klein says here. It's kind of a short form summary. He writes this. He says, following the trail of Har-Mageddon back to Har-Mageddon has led us to examine a set of Old Testament passages containing the phrase Yarkate Tzafon. That's in English, that's the heights of the north. Okay. From the first two of those occurrences, Isaiah 14 and in Psalm 48, verses 1 and 2, it has appeared that Har-Mageddon is identifiable with Mount Zaphon or Mount Zion. And right away, we know we're dealing with cosmic geography because Jerusalem, Zion, is not located in the north of the land, is it? Jerusalem is in Judah. It's in the south. But nevertheless, it's called the heights of the north in Psalm 48, 1 and 2. Heights of the north. The Yarkate Tzafon, the Har-Moed in Canaanite literature, was Baal's mountain. This is the reference, back in Isaiah 14, where you have the rebel, again, and Baal becomes the Satan figure, says, I will be like the Most High. I will be above the stars of God. I will sit as ruler at the Mount of Assembly, the heights of the north. So this notion that in the cosmic north, again, and in Canaanite, it was linked geographically, to a specific mountain that's far distant from Jerusalem. This is it's either Hermon or Jebel El Akhra, and it's probably both, depending on what passage you're in. But this is the seat of the power of the gods. And so the psalmist in Psalm 48 says, I'm sorry, but the real cosmic center is not this place. Psalm 68, Yahweh says, I'm going to take it captive. It belongs to me. And of course, Paul quotes Psalm 68 in Ephesians 4 about the leading captivity captive, all that stuff that's in Unseen Realm. So we have a spiritual competition between the cosmic mountain in Canaanite and all the way back to Sumerian theology and the place where Yahweh has chosen to put his name, which is Zion. Psalm 48 refers to Zion with all the terminology that his supernatural enemies, Yahweh's supernatural enemies, use for their dominion. It'd be like if it's the Lord of the Rings. It'd be like Gondor, Aragorn, who's the Christ figure, saying, no, Mordor is nothing. Gondor is really the cosmic center here. And he would start, using Mordor epithets of Gondor just to stick it in the eye, of Sauron. This is what you have going on here in biblical setting. So Psalm 48 refers to Zion, which is in the south, as the heights of the north. So back to Klein. This is all part of his argument. He says Ezekiel 38 and 39 is another passage. It's the third passage in addition to Isaiah 14 and Psalm 48. And here we discover a fundamental correspondence between the Zaphon, Magedon, and Gog-Magog concepts. He says these concepts get married in Ezekiel 38 and 39. Klein writes, that means that the Har-Mageddon crisis of Revelation 16, verses 14 through 16, and the series of parallel passages in Revelation is to be identified with the millennium-ending Gog-Magog event of Revelation 20, 7 through 10. He's saying, look, all of these cycles need to be seen for what they are. They're cycles, and the final cycle is Revelation 20. It's not, we can't read this as a linear sequence of different events. It's a repetition of the same events. Klein says, the Revelation 20 passage is replete with allusions to Ezekiel 38 and 39, including, along with the explicit mention, by name of Gog and Magog, The distinctive central theme of Ezekiel 38 and 39, which is the universal gathering of the world forces to destroy God's people and their catastrophic overthrow by the descent of fiery judgment from heaven. Accordingly, it is generally acknowledged that Ezekiel's prophecy and the vision of the loosing of Satan after the 1,000 years in Revelation 20 describe the same eschatological event. Lots of scholars land here because it's obvious. You don't have John in Revelation 20 coming up with a different Gog and Magog other than the one in Ezekiel 38 and 39. That's ridiculous. And everybody knows it. But again, there are people who would try to evade this because they want to read Revelation as a linear sequence of events here, and it doesn't work. You have to literally make up a second Gog-Magog event, or ignore all the Ezekiel 38 and 39 language in Revelation 16 through 19. Just pretend it's not there. So, this is my comment, now just getting away from Klein a little bit. Again, I just want to press the point. We have to get away from this, in this section of the book of Revelation, this notion of we have a neat linear chronology. Basically, we don't. And we have to look at the recycling. The recapitulation is clear in many places. So what Klein does is he starts with a clear connection between Revelation 16, that's sort of the beginning of the section, and then Revelation 20. That's how he does it in his article. So let's take a look at that. Klein writes, a main consideration in establishing the identity of the Revelation 16 Har-Mageddon crisis. Remember, Revelation 16 is where you specifically get the term used, Har-Mageddon. We need to establish the identity of the Revelation 16 Har-Mageddon crisis and the Ezekiel 38-39 Gog crisis. So he says if we can do that, if we can link Revelation 16 to Ezekiel 38 and 39, then it's much easier to link all of that to Revelation 20 because Gog and Magog are mentioned by name. So this is his goal. He says the Antichrist element is common to both Revelation 16 and Ezekiel 38-39. The Antichrist identity of the dragon-like beast in the Har-Mageddon episode would be acknowledged by most interpreters, irrespective of their millennial preferences. For the continuity of this beast of Revelation 16 with the fourth beast of Daniel 7, in the final phase of the little horn expression, is obvious, and it is. And in Daniel, an alternative representation of this bestial eschatological foe is the self-deifying king of Daniel 11:36. Again, all the systems know this too. Everybody agrees on this. This is the figure interpreted by Paul as the Antichrist in 2 Thessalonians 2:4. It remains now to show that the Antichrist element is also conspicuously present in Ezekiel 38 and 39. So Klein says, let's go. And here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to summarize his lines of evidence for this. So just so you know where he's going, where we're going, is we're taking the obvious. We'll start with the obvious that all of the eschatological systems agree on. When we read Revelation 16, we get all this Antichrist stuff. We know it relates to Daniel 2. We know it relates to Daniel 7. We know it relates to the little horn. We know it relates to Daniel 11:36, the figure that makes himself God. And we know that Paul picks up on that very idea in 2 Thessalonians 2:4 to describe the Antichrist. Everybody knows all those elements. Everybody agrees. So what Klein says, what remains, what people just don't do, including scholars, is they don't look back at Ezekiel 38 and 39 and see how that passage is used by John in Revelation 16 to reinforce, to articulate his Antichrist Armageddon story, his prophecy. That's what they don't see. And so what Klein says, come along with me. Let's look where Ezekiel 38 and 39, and maybe Psalm 48 a little bit, some of these other passages, where they're used in Revelation 16. So this is where he starts. So here's his first line of evidence. Where does Gog hail from? Where does he come from? Well, Klein says, let's think about the heights of the north. Psalm 48 relates the marshaling of enemy forces against Zion in that passage. So let me read you Psalm 48. And if you've read Unseen Realm, this should be familiar. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God. Obviously, Jerusalem. His holy mountain, beautiful in elevation, is the joy of all the earth. Mount Zion, in the Yarkatate Saphon, in the far north, the city of the great king. Even though Jerusalem, Zion is in the south, we're going to say it's in the far north because we're doing theology. The psalmist is doing theology and cosmic geography. He's not doing literal geography. He's doing cosmic geography to do theology. Here's verse 3. Within her, Jerusalem's citadels, God has made himself known as a fortress. For behold, the kings assembled as they came on together. As soon as they saw it, they were astounded. They were in panic. They took to flight. Trembling took hold of them there, anguish as of a woman in labor. Okay. By the east wind you shattered the ships of Tarshish. I love the reference to Tarshish there. Basically, everybody's gathered against Zion. We're not going to forget about little Tarshish, Spain. They get in on the act too. As we have heard, so we have seen in the city of the Lord of hosts, in the city of our God, which God will establish forever. So we're preparing for battle. It's all the nations against Zion in the heights of the north. Cosmic geography, okay? So Klein says, let's notice that. You get the heights of the north, Zion's in the far north. Then he says, Gog, lo and behold, who would have thought? Gog is also from the Yarkatate Saphon. Okay, the phrase is used in Ezekiel 38:6, Ezekiel 38:15, Ezekiel 39:2. Klein writes, it is from the heights of Zaphon that God brings Gog with all his enemies to overthrow them on the mountains of Israel, and specifically at Zion. So there's one connection. Okay. So first line of evidence is, where does Gog come from? Lo and behold, again, it sounds a lot like what's going on, the gathering of the nations, from the north. Gog's characterization, number 2, as a usurper of the Har-Mageddon, the place of counsel. Now we know this from Isaiah 14. The cosmic rebel seeks to ascend the heights of Saphon and be the Most High. Thus, the great eschatological enemy in Revelation 16:16 marches on the heights of the north, Zion. Again, we're seeing Isaiah 14 repeated at Armageddon. Interestingly enough, Isaiah 14 is directed against, drumroll please, not the Chinese, not the Russians, but the king of Babylon, whereby the prophet uses the cosmic rebellion story to portray this king. In Revelation, the enemy is Babylon and the beast. Klein writes, Gog is characterized by the Antichrist syndrome. I love that phrase. He is a pretender to the throne of heaven. The correspondence of his experience to the king of Babylon typology in Isaiah 14 is seen in the ironic motif of the polar contrast between his pretensions and his actual fate, like 180 degrees different. Klein writes, challenging Yahweh's sovereignty on Zion, Gog would take possession of the mountain heights of Israel. But he ends up with his vast military array in the depths of a valley. He lunged for a heavenly throne, but plunged into a netherworld grave. Remember Isaiah 14? I'll be like the Most High. But he's brought into Sheol. Now, on this point about, can we really call the valley where Gog and Magog, and we read Ezekiel 38 and 39, where Gog's armies end up in this valley, is that really a netherworld grave? Is that really the underworld? Is that really cosmic? Oh, yeah. Klein writes, the valley where his armies were buried is called the Valley of the Ovarim in Ezekiel 39-11, literally, those passing through or passing across. That is a term used for the dead. those who cross over from this world to the next. It appears in Job 34:20, Psalm 144:4. Another name given to the burial valley in Ezekiel 39:11 is Ge-Hamon-Gog, Valley of the Multitude of Gog. Now this netherworld grave description is legit, if only from Ezekiel 39:11, but the word translated travelers in that passage in ESV, those who pass through or pass across. The word overim is significant. I'm going to read from DDD, the Dictionary of Deities and Demons. Okay, here's what their entry on this term, the travelers, the overim, says in part. The participle cal plural overim of the verb avar, to pass from one side to the other, seems to have a special meaning in the context of the cult of the dead, denoting the spirits of the dead crossing the border between the land of the living and the world of the dead. It can be interpreted as a divine name in Ezekiel 38 or 39:11 and 39:14, which may have also been preserved in the geographical named Avarim. This is Numbers 21:10 and 11, 27:12, 33:44, 33:47 through 48, Deuteronomy 32:49, and Jeremiah 22:20. In Ezekiel 39:14, the word indicates the dead, just dead bodies, okay. A possible solution to this crux interpretum is to relate overim here and in verse 11 to the overim mentioned in the Ugaritic text denoting the spirits of the dead. So it's not just dead bodies. It's also a term that is used in wider Canaanite literature for the spirits of the dead. The valley of the overim is located, quote, east of the sea. That's Ezekiel 39:11, which is very likely the Dead Sea. So it was part of the Transjordan. This is a region which shows many traces of ancient cults of the dead, such as the megalithic monuments called dolmens and place names referring to the dead and the netherworld, such as Ovot, which means the spirits of the dead, Peor, as in Baal of Peor, and Avarim. That's the end of the entry. If you have read my demons book, or I think even I do this in the angels book, that the passage in Jude about Michael contending with the devil for the body of Moses, this is the key to understanding that. Because where Moses dies and is buried, remember, he never gets into the promised land. He is buried in a place associated with the netherworld, the realm of the dead, the spirits of the dead. And so there was a strong tradition growing out of the burial place and the Old Testament terminology. It was a dark place. There developed this tradition about, is Moses okay? What happened to Moses' body? And so Michael, who is the Prince of Israel, is the one who, quote unquote, rescues or protects Moses from the Lord of the dead. This is the place where Gog is defeated and his troops wind up. Does it sound like Isaiah 14? The answer is yes. Okay, so that's thread number 2. Thread number 3, Klein says, well, what about the destination of Gog? We've talked about where Gog hails from. Where does he come from? We've talked about him having the Antichrist complex, that I'm going to go conquer, the cosmic mountain. I'm going to go defeat Yahweh. That doesn't turn out so well for him. What about the destination of Gog? Ezekiel 38 and 39 make this quite clear. Where is Gog headed? Klein writes, Gog advances against the mountains of Israel, 39:2, 39:17, Ezekiel. It is God's chosen Mount Zion in the heart of those mountains that is his central point of attack. As in the case of the mustering of the bestial armies in Revelation 16, the destination and intended target for Gog and his hosts is Har-Magedon, where the Lord's anointed is enthroned at his right hand. The indications for this are clear. Even though Zion is not mentioned by name in Ezekiel 38 and 39, God does speak of the mountains of Israel as my mountains, 38:21, and of the land of Israel as my land, 38:16. Implicit in that is the royal mountain city where Yahweh dwells and rules over the mountainous domains he claims as his own. Also, such a capital city on the cosmic mountain was regarded as the center of the earth. And we've talked about this. Let me just interrupt Klein here. We've talked about this before about cosmic mountain terminology. Eden, Tabernacle, Temple, Sinai. These places were viewed as the place where heaven and earth intersect. They are the center of the earth, not in terms of actual physical geography, but they are the center of the earth, and that this is the place from which God runs things. Okay? So back to Klein, he says, in 38:12, Gog is described as scheming to assault the people of God dwelling at, quote, the center, literally the navel of the earth, unquote. In that concept, Gog's real objective is exposed. Yahweh's Mount of Assembly, rival to Gog's pseudo-Zaphon. In the Revelation 20 version of Ezekiel 38 and 39, Gog's armies are explicitly said to compass, quote, the beloved city, unquote, okay, which is Jerusalem and Zion. Trajectory number 4. What about Gog in Revelation 20? Klein summarizes this point as follows. He says, in Revelation 20, verses 7 through 10, the Gog-Magog assault on Zion marks the end of the millennium. Within Ezekiel 38 and 39, indications also abound of the eschatological finality of the Gog crisis. As in Revelation 20, it comes after a long age of secure preservation for God's people, Ezekiel 38:8. In New Testament terms, after the age in which the church, though sorely persecuted, is preserved by the Lord to complete the Great Commission task, Revelation 11:7. And as the judgment on Gog in Revelation 20 merges with the resurrection of the dead for final judgment, that's Revelation 20, verses 11 through 15, so God's judicial deliverance of his people from Gog in Ezekiel 38 and 39 institutes for them the eternal state of unending, never again disturbed felicity, described in Ezekiel 39, 21 through 29. So Klein has laid out 4 trajectories that align Revelation 16, okay, Armageddon, with Ezekiel 38 and 39. They're all clear. They all make sense. Again, if you're reading the passage in light of John's use of the Old Testament, if you're not doing that, then you're making something up. You're talking about Russia and China or something like that. Well, go ahead. I can't stop you. But, John isn't quoting from Mao Zedong, okay? Or, something that Lenin wrote or Marx. He's quoting from the Old Testament. He's quoting from Ezekiel 38 and 39 and Psalm 48, a little bit of, Zechariah 14, some Daniel, okay? John's use of the Old Testament tells us how to read chapters 16 through 19. So you might ask, well, how does this connect to Revelation 19 specifically? Because that's where we are here in this episode. As all interpreters of the book agree, Revelation 19, 11 through 21, which we read at the beginning, is the outcome of the great war against the beast. It's the outcome of Armageddon. It describes the climactic battle won by the returning Christ, the messianic warrior and judge. Revelation 19 repurposes descriptive content from the Gog and Magog battle in Ezekiel 38 and 39. Revelation 19 does it too. It's not just Revelation 16. So Klein writes, instruments of judgment mentioned by both Ezekiel and John include earthquakes, Ezekiel 38, 19, and 20. Again, align that with not only Revelation 16, 18 through 20, but earlier in the book. Sword, Ezekiel 38, 21, see Revelation 19, 15, and 21. And destructive hail and fiery brimstone, Ezekiel 38, 22, Ezekiel 39, verse 6. Align that with Revelation 16, 21 and Revelation 19, 20. Most striking, Klein says, is the distinctive motif of God's summoning the birds and beasts to feed on the carcasses of the defeated enemies Gog had gathered. The banquet theme elaborated in Ezekiel 39:4 and Ezekiel 39:17 through 20. And John incorporates that that passage, Ezekiel 39:4 and 17 through 20, he specifically incorporates that into the account of Christ's victory over the beast and his assembled armies in Revelation 19:17 through 18. You will look in vain. Okay, you will look in vain to find some other passage in the Old Testament where we have the birds and the beasts summoned to feed on the carcasses of the dead at the cosmic mountain. There is only one passage that does that in the Old Testament, and it's Ezekiel 39. It's Gog and Magog. So that is how Revelation 19 connects. So we've seen Revelation 16, 17, 17 and 18 are really about the beast. Specifically, Revelation 16 and 19 repeat, repurpose, recapitulate content from Ezekiel 38 and 39, the Gog and Magog event, before we even get to Revelation 20, where Gog and Magog are mentioned by name. So we've got a repetition cycle between chapter 16, chapter 19, and chapter 20. They're describing the same series of events. It is not a linear chronology of three separate events. It is a recycling of one event three times. And if you do that, what it means, before you get to Gog and Magog in Revelation 20, before you hit there, you get all these references to the 1,000 years. If they're describing the same thing, then those 1,000 years must represent the believers of chapter 16 and the believers, the believing age in chapter 16, the believing age in chapter 19. It's the current present age. Now, to put it lightly, all of this cannot be coincidence. Now, Klein uses the very clear recycling again in his mind to devastate premillennial eschatology. And this is what I was raised on. Pre-trib rapture, premillennial, return of Jesus, literal 1,000-year kingdom, so on and so forth. And Klein, by virtue of his skilled ferreting out of how John uses Ezekiel 38 and 39 in more than one place in these chapters, destroys that system. Doesn't really destroy a rapture question. I mean, that's a little bit different of a question, but it destroys the system, the general premillennial system. And he's happy to do so because he's an amillennialist. Now, I would say, well, Professor Klein, as much as I love you and your article, that's kind of a yes and no. What does this all mean? We're gonna wrap the episode with a few of these observations. What does this all mean? Well, the Old Testament use of John by Ezekiel 38 and 39 in chapters that precede the second coming. Notice it preceded the return of the Lord, because the return of the Lord, marks the climax of Armageddon. And it's also done, Ezekiel 38 and 39 are also in the chapters that follow the second coming, Revelation 20. This forces the conclusion that the kingdom language up through Revelation 20 is basically the present church age. Now, you can't really argue out of that because you'd have to have two battles of Armageddon, not one. Okay? You'd have to have two Gog and Magog events, not one. It doesn't make any sense. There's only one Armageddon. There's one battle for Zion. There's one there's one second coming. And, there's one Gog and Magog battle. So that's point. That's point number one. That's what it means. This is where you're driven by the text. Now that in turn produces an eschatology. Here's point number two. That has the present age, the church age, headed toward Armageddon. Well, there's no surprise there. I mean, pretty much everybody would track with that. But millers like Klein will use the abstraction of 1,000 years. See, we told you 1,000 years doesn't mean a literal 1,000 years. It just means a long time because the church has been around for more than 1,000 years. So it's an abstract idea. So millennialists like Klein will use that abstraction in Revelation 20 to abstract everything else out of existence. Like a real Antichrist. Does Klein believe that there will be a real personal Antichrist? I'm not sure. A lot of millennialists don't. How about a real concerted chaos system driven by real supernatural beings? Well, we already know a lot of people in the evangelical world, and unfortunately mostly in the Reformed context where you'll find amillennialism, they don't believe that. That's too weird. It's too supernatural. Give us our core doctrines of the faith, and that's the supernaturalism we have. We don't want any more. So we know that happens. Third, how about the real release of demonic supernatural forces in Revelation 9? Well, most amillennialists would not say that's the release of the Watchers. Again, that's too weird. Because if we said that, then we'd have to affirm Genesis 6. God forbid. How about the real re-inheritance of the nations and the real fulfillment of the Psalm 82 judgment of the real rebel gods? Well, we know they don't want to touch Psalm 82. How about the real literal transformation of the earth back to a real Edenic state in real time? A lot of amillennialists don't want to go there either. The church is the present age, and then the Lord comes, and then we have the eternal state somewhere. It's this ethereal existence. And all this talk about the new earth and the new Eden, well, that's just flowery, allegorical language for something, for heaven, somewhere. I don't know. In other words, Klein and others will use the abstraction here to create a safe eschatological system for people who don't want to affirm these other quote-unquote bizarre supernatural elements. I don't. Okay, if you're wondering what their justification of such a dual hermeneutic might be, ask one of them. Not me, because I'm not the traditional amillennialist. Now, third observation about what all this means. Again, Klein targets premillennialism with this, but all he really destroys is the traditional definition of premillennialism. That's all he actually destroys. Pay attention carefully here to what I'm saying here. This is important. I mean, the rest of it's important, but this is important especially. If premillennialism means, quote, the system that takes Revelation as a linear chronology and bases its idea of a literal reign of Christ on earth only on the language of Revelation 20, verses 1 through 6, well, yeah, then Klein has destroyed that. But what if we ditch the millennial language? What if we focus instead on the Messiah literally ruling and reigning on earth without depending or even caring about the 1,000-year language? See, then the literal kingdom idea is alive and well, but it doesn't conform to our theological systems. Now, you already know this is where I'm at. Okay, my view of the literal earthly kingdom is the one that follows Armageddon and the final judgments, final resurrection, final judgments. It is the new Eden, and it is not 1,000 years. It is forever. 1,000 years doesn't cut it. 1,000 years is a blink of an eye for the reign of Christ on earth. But we're so bound to this language and bound to a word in Revelation 20 that when somebody like Klein comes along and shows us that we can't read Revelation 20 as a linear sequential chronology, and he destroys the system, we think, oh, I can't believe in a literal kingdom anymore. We might as well all just, suck up to Klein and be amillennialists. No. Now, the church age is the kingdom inaugurated when Eden returns to earth, really, in real time. That is the consummation of the kingdom, and it is not 1,000 years. It is forever. Klein has not touched that idea. He destroys a system. He does not destroy a point of biblical theology. Now, I would also add to this as a footnote, Klein actually doesn't undo even the traditional premillennial system talk entirely, because there's one reference to 1,000-year reign for which his use of the data does not account. And that's in Revelation 20, verse 6. And I'll get there in a moment. But the larger point here is that we ought to just ditch the traditional language. Folks, there is no cosmic rule that says you have to articulate your theology using a glossary from a theology book or a theological system. There's no penalty flag that's going to come out if you say things like, well, I don't really care if 1,000 years in Revelation 20 are the church age. I still believe that there's going to be a literal kingdom reign of Christ on earth. There's no penalty flag for that. Now, you're going to have people try to throw one because they can't think outside their box. What I'm saying is, don't care about their boxes. Again, some scholars just can't do this. And on a personal note here, they can't imagine living outside the boxes that traditional Christian theological schemes have made for us to play in. This is why even scholars, again, who, they can't think outside the box their seminary training gives them, will call me, Mike, yours truly, an amillennialist. Like the recent reviewer of my Demons book in the Master's Seminary Journal. The guy calls me an amillennialist. I'm not an amillennialist because I'm using traditional terms now. Amillennialists deny that there will be a literal messianic kingdom on earth. I don't. For amillennialists, the kingdom is the church now, and then an ethereal, eternal state forever, somewhere, in some form. They take the New Eden imagery as figurative, not literal. Again, I don't. So what if we ditch the language and tear apart the sandbox? Knock it down. My position is that when all this plays out on earth, that Christ will literally return, literally defeat the beast. In my view, that probably speaks more of a chaos system than a man, but I do think it includes a man. I think there will be a real Antichrist. And then Christ will literally reign forever on earth in a new global Eden. This is why I say 1,000-year kingdom is too short. Christ's kingdom on earth doesn't end after 1,000 years. We don't transition from the church age here and now to some sort of undefinable, non-literal reign somewhere in the clouds that the New Testament writers mistakenly described as earthly. It's too bad that I believe that defining an idea like the messianic kingdom by one word, the word 1,000 in Revelation 20, is a flawed approach. It's a system word and is no replacement to a biblical theological idea. So sorry, I'm not playing the word game. Theology should not derive from words that theologians coin or systems theologians create using words they find in the Bible. It should derive from biblical theological data, and the data pool here is a lot wider than Revelation 20. My actual view is far from traditional amillennialism. Maybe as far as you can get without being an atheist. And I'm sorry, if you can't think outside your box, that's too bad. I might shed a tear for you, but probably not. Now, again, as we wrap up here, there's an obvious question to all this that Klein has to answer. Klein is deceased. I mean, he can't, respond to it, obviously now. But all of the systems have to, especially if you're a traditional amillennialist. Everybody has, anyone who's not in the traditional premillennial camp has to account for this question. Now, I'm going to tell you what the question is because it's going to be the focus of our next episode. So here we go. Now, if the kingdom language from Revelation 16 through 20 is basically about the present church age, headed toward Armageddon and toward the return of Jesus, then what is said about Satan in Revelation 20, 1 through 7 becomes an issue. Now listen to this. I'm going to read Revelation 20, first 7 verses. Then I saw, and I'm going to add a few, thoughts in here just to make the point clear. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. In other words, he bound him for the length of the church age, and threw him into the pit, and shut it, and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer, until the 1,000 years were ended. In other words, until the length of the church age had ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. Okay, that's part of the Armageddon event. Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. Also I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image and had not received its mark on their foreheads or on their hands, or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. In other words, the dead in Christ during the length of the church age get resurrected and they reign with Christ. Well, they can't reign with Christ in a literal king because we're amillennial. Maybe, I get it. Those who were martyred, they are alive in heaven. And so during the length of the church age, they're ruling in heaven. That's actually what most amillennialists believe, by the way. Verse 5, the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. In other words, until the end of the church age. Okay, well, all right. This is the first resurrection. So I guess that's when they get new bodies, and now they're ruling and reigning something that isn't literal, but it's not the church age because the church age is over. Verse 6, blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such, the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they, i.e. the ones raised after the church age ends, will reign with him for 1,000 years. Oops. You see, this 1,000 years cannot refer to the church age, because the church age has ended, according to the preceding verses. So here we have a reference to 1,000 years that can't be the church age. So Klein's approach doesn't account for this one reference in verse 6, does it? And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison. That's verse 7. Well, which 1,000 years? The first 1,000 years, the church age, or the age that comes after the church age? So what I'm getting at is Klein's approach is devastating to traditional premillennial thinking, but it's not as clear as he'd like to think. Verse 6 muddies it, but the larger point is you don't need it anyway. The concept of a literal messianic reign on earth is built from a data pool that is much wider than Revelation 20, verse 6. So we're going to say a little bit more about this in the next episode. And the bigger question, I'm not going to get back into all the millennial stuff because we've done enough of that here. But here's the bigger question. What about Satan? What could it possibly mean to have Satan being bound during the church age, if that's what 1,000 years means? How is Satan bound during the present age? So that, quote, he might not deceive the nations, unquote. Looks to me like there's plenty of deception going on. Earlier in the book of Revelation, John has Satan alive and well persecuting believers. Revelation 2:10, Revelation 2:13, and trying to kill off the Messiah child. That's Revelation 12. The rest of the New Testament has a number of passages that presume Satan is active in tempting, persecution, in blinding the eyes of the unbelievers. So how are those ideas true in light of what Klein and others are saying about Revelation 20? And how could Revelation 20 be true in regard to Satan with all this other stuff in the New Testament? How can this make sense? How do we get a sensible portrayal of Satan out of Revelation 20 if we're supposed to be reading this? And again, I'm sold by Klein's presentation here, but he has to answer this question, and he doesn't do it in the article. And frankly, the amillennialist answer to this is weak. I think there's a better answer to it. But if we're going to regard the 1,000 years here as the church age, Satan is limited in some respects so that he might not deceive the nations. We have to figure out what that means, because whatever it means, it can't run and fly in the face of all this other stuff Satan is doing now in the present age. So how do we do that? That's going to be one of the places we camp, really the first thing we tackle in the next episode.